had forgotten, I found an article on this vase. A vase found in prehistoric rock, way before mankind supposedly existed, way before creatures that are living existed, found in prehistoric rock, but it indicates, if it's true, civilization has always been extant, pointing to a recent creation, which always included mankind. Or who put that rock in solid rock? How would you get that vase in solid rock? Found in 1851, Dorchester, Massachusetts. It was discovered in solid rock. The rock formation is known as the Roxbury Conglomerate, which is Precambrian, which means that it was before that rock strata anything existed. Supposedly over 534 million years old. This rock is supposed to be a record of life on Earth before any multicellular life evolved. Yet here is an undeniable human artifact. Man supposedly appeared no more than 2.5 million years ago. We'll just fix that typo. Okay. 2.5 million years ago, in his most primitive form, according to evolution. This object refutes the whole evolutionary interpretation of the strata we see worldwide, and supports the creationist assertion that most of the strata were formed during the global flood. That's why things are all so mixed up. Put a bunch of water in a particular place and it'll mix everything up. That's what water does. This could be an artifact from a pre-flood civilization. The June 5th, 1852 Scientific American article about this alloy vessel, it's metal alloy, says probably carpenter or bronze, that says something interesting. The editor suggests the vessel may have been by Tubal-Cain, the biblical father of metallurgy. Tubal-Cain is found in Genesis 4:22 before the flood. This same scientific magazine today is totally anti-creationist and anti-biblical. Darwin had not succeeded in getting the educational institutions to preach his theory yet. The evidence supports the literal reading of Genesis and totally destroys the evolutionary idea of millions and billions of years for the formation of the geologic record. Conclusions. Point 7. A catastrophic universal flood is the only way to explain the Earth today, the surface, topographical surface of the Earth. Throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th, most theologians and scientists of the Western world correctly believed that the worldwide flood, the deluge, was responsible for the major fossiliferous strata of the Earth. But the rise of Cuvier's false theory of successive catastrophes, which assigned most of the fossil strata to ages long before the creation of man, which is totally unbiblical, caused many to abandon the older and biblical flood theory of geology, even though it existed, in spite of unsubstantiated claims. There's no particular set of volumes, rhymes, or reason that is a scientific sense of why they changed from one dramatically opposed point of view to the other about evolution versus creation, or creation and then evolution. They just started talking about it. William Buckland led the way in Great Britain by falsely pointing to diluvium deposits as positive evidence of the last and greatest catastrophe in a fictitious series of catastrophes in the history of the Earth, the Genesis flood. This is a local flood, even though the account indicates worldwide. So he rewrote the account in Genesis 6 and then turned around and said this is what it is. But no sooner had a large number of Christians accepted the successive catastrophes view than Buckland and Sedgwick, along with other geologists, began to make public recantations of their former views. So they started their career in one direction and turned around reversed. I guess that's what politics and geology is all about. The diluvium deposits were no longer attributed to the flood, but to the last of a series of pre-Adamic catastrophes. They didn't throw the Bible out wholesale, they just threw it out piece by piece. The flood, though still regarded as universal, was now falsely depicted as a comparatively tranquil affair, which left no discernible geologic effects. So you say, well, it existed, we just don't know, we don't have any evidence that it did. Well, how do you know either way? All of the geologic effects on the Earth were thereby falsely attributed to events occurring over a fictitious period of time before Adam, when Scripture indicates no such thing. By now, the Church was ready for the final and false stage of the forced harmonization process between the true biblical flood account and the false theory of a local flood. For in 1839, John Pye Smith set forth his theory that the flood was nothing but a local inundation in the Mesopotamian valley. Freed at long last from the necessity of harmonizing false theories of geology with Genesis, scientists dismissed the Genesis flood with their minds and joined Sir Charles Lyell in his efforts to patiently untie the Gordian knot of fossiliferous strata according to the false uniformitarian principles which he had enunciated as early as 1830 with hardly any proof at all. Thus, and there's still no substantive proof, thus it was under the steadily increasing blows of erroneous geological theorizing the biblical flood faded from the intellectual horizon of the Western world to a mere shadow of its former awe-inspiring grandeur, from a world-engulfing cataclysm to a mere Mesopotamian inundation. Where are the facts in the account in Genesis 6? There, nowhere. Many theologians of the 19th century, nurtured by a somewhat anemic philosophy of revelation, i.e., by utilizing a liberal approach of interpretation of the Bible, which permitted false spiritualizing of scriptural passages. That's where it started. But there was an agenda for the spiritualizing method of liberal interpretation. They had an agenda that they wanted to arrive at a certain point and throw out the biblical creationism and put in Darwin. So, they permitted false spiritualizing of scriptural passages to mean whatever one desired them to mean, fell into line with the latest scientific speculations, which were actually unscientific and false, fearing lest they might be found at odds with Copernicus and Galileo, again, as the geologists were always ready to remind them, rather than fearing being at odds with God. Since the books of nature and revelation cannot ultimately contradict each other, it was falsely assumed that the new discoveries of the geologists and the false interpretations which they were giving to these discoveries were God's own clues for exegeting the early chapters of Genesis rather than the other way around, and that men like Buckland and Lyell were the inspired prophets of God's book of nature. Interesting, because, I've read, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And it doesn't say about a preconditioned creation. And the earth was null and void. Yeah, there was no life on it. So they had to read into that too. And just when one thing, you have to read their book to read the Bible. The viewpoint that science rather than Scripture must speak the final word on the magnitude of the flood certainly did not die with the 19th century, as the wholehearted acceptance by evangelical theologians of the evidence of Sir Leonard Woolley's flood stratum so clearly demonstrates. Nevertheless, a significant minority of Christians have continued to look upon these false harmonizations of Genesis and geology with profound misgivings, and would concur with the judgment of Andrew E. White that each mixed up more or less of science with more or less of Scripture and produces a result more or less absurd. It's like trying to make a harmonization between Republicans and Democrats today. From this study, we may draw one vitally important lesson for the present hour. The biblical doctrine of the flood cannot be harmonized with the false uniformitarian theories of geology. A careful examination of the various blind alleys into which evangelical Christians have been led should serve as a solemn warning to those who are still perishing in the hopeless task of harmonizing two mutually exclusive philosophies of nature and history. It is the conviction of the writers, at least, that a true historical geology will never be formulated until the Genesis flood, as a universal aqueous catastrophe, is granted its rightful and vital place in the thinking of Christian men of science. All right, new topic here on the same general idea of scriptural testimony, physical evidence from Earth which testify to a recent creation. Methods of age measurement indicate a young Earth. How many people think the opposite? All we have to do is investigate. Introduction. Even aside from the biblical testimony against the radioactivity age estimates for the Earth and its formations, there are numerous evidences in geology itself against the validity of these tremendous time durations. The currently accepted figure for the age of the Earth, as deduced from radioactivity of uranium and other elements, is about 5 to 6 billion years, with the solidification of the crust dated about 4 billion years. But there are many geological processes which appear to be at least as suitable for geochronometric purposes as the phenomena of radioactivity, and which give much lower estimates than this. None of these is sufficiently precise for accurate measurements, and all involve the same sort of unlikely assumptions as the radioactivity methods, but they are nevertheless sufficiently meaningful to cast very serious doubt on the reliability of the radioactivity estimates. Most people use carbon dating, but carbon dating can't go beyond 50,000 years, and they say it's millions. It just measures the amount of carbon material in whatever substance that they're looking at, and the problem with that is we haven't saturated the atmosphere in Earth, even at this time, with carbon-14. So your methods of measurement are going to be inaccurate to begin at the best. So, and also I remember looking at a study of a rock that was near an ancient riverbed that is now dry, and the whole point was that one end of the rock was millions of years older than the other, but the rock was only a couple of feet long. And besides that, if that rock were underwater, which it appeared to be on a riverbed, uranium is soluble. So how much uranium is there? And then you look at the lead compared to uranium. Lead appears often as original lead, not part of the uranium. So it's just absurd to think that this is an accurate measure of anything. So by all odds, the most important and serious of problems relative to origins is that of time. There are many lines of geological evidence apparently implying that the Earth and its various crustal formations are immensely older than a straightforward biblical system of interpretation can allow. The latter, as we have seen, involves a relatively recent creation and deluge as the cause of most of the Earth's geologic features. There are many different ways by which geologists have attempted to measure the absolute age of the Earth and its various formations and deposits. In each such method, some physical or chemical process is found whose present rate of activity can be measured. The total accumulation of the product of the process must also be measured. If all of this is true, and it is not, then it would be a simple matter of mathematics then to calculate how long the process must have been in operation in order to have produced its present results. Some of the processes which have been used as supposed geologic chronometers involve the influx of sodium and other chemicals into the ocean and into lakes and from rivers, the erosion of gorges and other areas by running water or wind, by glaciers, the building of deltas or other sedimentary deposits, the growth of chemical deposits in soils or caves or other places. Of course, this begs the question, how do you know things have been always the same so that this measurement isn't going to be changed by some extraneous event? You know, the weathering of rocks, the accumulation of annual bands in trees. How do you know the bands of trees are 1 year apart? They insist there are. But there's some bands in some trees occurred when a local flood came along and changed things dramatically. And some people observed this. So not every ring represents 365 years. So the accumulation of annual bands in trees or lake beds or other entities whose appearance may be affected by seasonal changes instead of a whole year, the escape of terrestrial gases into the atmosphere, the efflux of connate waters through volcanism to the Earth's surface, and various other like processes, which, as you look at them detailed carefully, they're never that consistent to be measured, especially over a long period of time. There are also various astronomic parameters that have been used to determine absolute age, most of them based on the rate